in which Kamala prepares a meal for her family near Patna, Bihar, February 1811. Freshly bathed, Kamala set about preparing her family's evening meal. First, she smoothed fresh cow dung in a circle to define a purified cooking space and sprinkled it with a few drops of water. Then she took some chilies and cast them on the grinding stone with a few drops of safflower oil. She crushed the chilies to a fine paste and added them to flour made from finely ground maize. When she stepped outside the area of the hearth to fetch water, she was careful to wash her hands and feet again before returning to her cooking. She poured a little of the water into corn flour and kneaded it vigorously to make an unboiled pudding known as sattu. Meanwhile, Kamala's daughter prepared a chutney by grinding together a few black peppercorns, some salt, and a little ginger with a handful of Bengali currants. When the food was ready, the women called the men to come and eat. They broke off from their work of strewing the fertilizing ashes from the fireplace around the poppies. They too washed their hands and feet, then cast a small amount of food into the fire. Kamala served her husband first, and then their two sons, the elder followed by the younger. The women would eat later, once the men had had their fill. Kamala and her family lived near Patna in the province of Bihar. In 1811, the province had been under East India Company rule for nearly 40 years. In 1765, their army had defeated the combined forces of the Mughal emperor and the Nawab of Bengal, and as a result, they were able to force the emperor to grant the company itself, rather than an Indian noble, the governorship of the province. Ownership of the land was transferred to the tax-collecting nobility, or zamindaries, who were thus transformed into a version of Britain's landed aristocracy. But rather than creating a body of English-style improving landlords, the company brought into being a rapacious rentier class, whose aim was to extract as much revenue from their tenants as possible. To the satisfaction of the East India Company, the peasantry raised the money to pay their taxes by growing cash crops such as indigo and cotton. The cash crop of most value to the company was opium. East India Company merchants were aware that there was a steady demand for Bengal opium among the Chinese. Since European traders had introduced tobacco to China in the late 16th century, smoking and drinking tea had become such complementary activities for the Chinese that they found it hard to imagine engaging in one without the other, and referred to the practice as yencha, smoke and tea. Early in the 18th century, tea house owners had introduced a new, expensive blend of tobacco cut with opium, and by the end of the century, the wealthy had dispensed with the tobacco altogether. In China, smoking pure opium became a mark of elite social status. Chinese gentlemen demonstrated their affluence and good taste with the elaborate equipment associated with opium inhalation: inlaid wooden boxes, intricate lamps, decorated spoons and pipes. Opium devotees showed a marked preference for the mild Patna opium from eastern India over the more fiery and potentially irritating Malwa opium grown in the west. The East India Company realized that the Indian district over which they now ruled produced a commodity for which there was a potentially vast Chinese market. In 1773, they took over the production and sale of opium in Bengal. Each September, the company granted licenses to cultivate poppies to skilled market gardeners like Kamala and her family, who lived around Patna and Benares. Poppies were a temperamental crop, and the harvesting of the opium was labor-intensive. Small incisions had to be made in the thousands of seed heads over a period of 3 to 4 weeks. It was back-breaking work to scrape the latex oozing from the incisions into a shallow brass bowl. The work involved the farmer's entire family, and in this way the East India Company co-opted a large body of hidden and unpaid labour. In the spring, the company's assistant sub-deputy would tour the villages, supervising the various headmen as they weighed and graded the cakes of crude opium. It was packed into large earthenware jars, loaded onto carts, and transported under armed guard to one of two company processing factories at Bankipur and Ghazipur. Here it was refined, shaped into balls, covered with a protective wrapper of steamed poppy petals, and packed into 140-pound chests. These were then transported to Calcutta, where they were sold at auction to private shipping companies. This was where the company's official involvement with the opium trade ended. The company delegated the illegal section of the trade to private merchants. In theory, imports of opium into China were banned. However, lying at anchor just off the southern Chinese coast were a number of heavily armed, broken-down East Indiamen. The merchants used these as floating opium warehouses. The ships from Calcutta would unload their chests of opium onto the receiving ships, and at night, Chinese smugglers would row out to them in their longboats with many oars, known as scrambling dragons. Drawing alongside, they would place a bag of silver in one side of a scale, and the merchants would balance it with opium, the price being weight for weight. The longboats then made their way up the Pearl River past Canton, running the gauntlet of the numerous checkpoints and patrols that were supposed to make it impossible for European goods to enter China without the permission of the Chinese authorities. But the customs officers and soldiers manning the patrols were in the pay of the smugglers and turned a blind eye to their comings and goings. From the late 18th century until the end of British rule in India in 1947, opium revenues were the third most important source of income for the Indian government after land revenue and the salt tax. Nevertheless, rather than being reinvested in India, by far the greater proportion of the money generated by their labour was remitted back to Britain. By means of the China trade, opium production allowed the company and its agents to siphon off India's wealth. For Chinese labourers, a pipe of opium was the equivalent of the British workman's cup of sweetened tea. Opium was at times abused, and it was addictive, but the idea that China was incapacitated by a hopelessly drug-addicted population was absurd propaganda. A British consul based in Hainan was surprised to find that, although nearly everyone uses opium, one never meets the opium skeleton so vividly depicted in philanthropic works. Rather the reverse, a hardy peasantry, healthy and energetic. Why then did the Chinese government demonize the opium habit and take measures to suppress the trade? Qing officials blamed the opium trade for the silver famine the Chinese economy was experiencing. Every year, purchases of opium were draining $18 million worth of silver out of the economy. Merchant ships returning to London, Calcutta and Bombay did stash silver bullion in their holds, as well as crates of tea, but the Chinese seem to have been unaware that about 3/4 of the silver paid for opium was channeled straight back to them in payment for tea and silk. The causes of China's silver famine were, in fact, far more complex. In 1827, the depletion of Spain's American silver mines triggered a worldwide depression, and the quantity of silver entering the global market declined. The flow of silver into the Chinese economy from foreign merchants was therefore diminished. At the same time, declining production in the Yunnan copper mines led to the debasement of the copper and bronze coins that were China's real currency. But it was easier for officials to blame China's economic crisis on unscrupulous foreign merchants than it was to address the problem by improving the copper coinage and creating a stable silver currency. The issue of silver, opium, and the balance of trade was a smokescreen. The emperor and his government were humiliated by rumours that both the military and the Chinese merchants were openly conniving in the illegal opium trade. The response of the xenophobic section among Chinese officials was to call for a trade embargo. The emperor and his government, however, knew that this was neither in the government's financial interest, nor was it enforceable. In May 1836, Ran Yuan, the leader of a group of bureaucrats in alliance with a Canton-based merchants' academy, the Xuechai Tang, suggested to the emperor that the problem would best be tackled by both legalizing the import of Indian opium and encouraging domestic production. This would hopefully pull the carpet out from under the smugglers' feet and allow the government to regulate both the trade and the drug's consumption. But a group of dissatisfied literati, calling themselves the Spring Purification Movement, persuaded the emperor to embark on a crusade against opium addiction. The emperor scrapped Yuan's legalization plans and appointed the Spring Purification Party's ally, Lin Zhu, as Governor-General of Canton. It was Lin who forced a diplomatic impasse in June 1839 by seizing and destroying the opium in the European factories within Canton and closing the channel to shipping, in effect imprisoning the foreign traders in the city. When William Jarden, until recently the foremost of Canton's opium merchants, arrived in London 2 months after the Chinese seizure of the Europeans' opium, he immediately began pressing Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, to wage war on China in retaliation. In November 1839, a British fleet arrived off the coast of Canton, including the Nemesis, the first iron paddle steamer to round the Cape of Good Hope, equipped with shells and Congreve rockets against which China's defences were hopelessly inadequate. The war ended ignominiously for them in August 1842, when they signed the Treaty of Nanking, still referred to in China as the first of the unequal treaties. The British forced the Chinese to open 5 treaty ports to their ships, and Canton returned to business as usual. Opium smoking came to symbolize China's inability to resist Europe's intrusion into its economy, and became regarded as a degenerate practice. The end result of the campaign of moral outrage was the first International Opium Commission, which met in Shanghai in 1909. The commission agreed to make illegal all trade in narcotic substances and to apply this principle globally. These commitments are the source of our contemporary legal framework outlawing opium and its derivatives. The opium trade tends to attract almost as much moral opprobrium as the Atlantic slave trade. The evil of opium is supposed to have drained silver out of the economy while turning the Chinese into a nation of hopeless addicts, smoking themselves to death while their country descended into chaos. However, by repeatedly retelling the story of the opium trade in these terms, we have fallen victim to an opium myth.